Hello, I'm Dr. Larissa Tracy, and welcome to Medieval Mischief and Mayhem. I am your host for this podcast, and today it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Tirumular Narayanan, an assistant professor of art history at Appalachian State University. He completed his Ph.D. in art history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2025. Born in California, Drew received his BA in Medieval and Early Modern Studies at the University of California, Davis, before going to California State University-Chico for his MA in art history. And that's where I met him. Drew's research and current book project focuses on late medieval French, Italian, and English illuminations depicting the Sultan of Babylon, a racialized Muslim supervillain in the Latin Christian imagination. In developing this work, he formulated his theoretical concept of cryptovisuality, which moves away from considering the expected markers of racialization, such as particular types of skin color, physiognomy, costume, and accoutrements. Instead, he champions new vistas where text-image interaction, semiotics, materiality, topography, imposterism, accusations of appropriation, and visualized expropriation can serve as equally substantive and powerful indices when dealing critically with pre-modern racialization. As a voracious consumer of 20th century pulp fiction, he also works on the development of racist medievalism in Americana. Most recently, he has co-authored an article with Tiffany Van Winkoop titled East of Camelot, Insufficient Whiteness and American Racial Etiquette in Prince Valiant, as part of an Arthuriana special issue on comics and Camelot. Drew has previously taught classes on race in the Middle Ages, global medieval art, Islamic art, first semester Arabic, and will be teaching a global early modern course this fall. He is also a lifelong member of Mirkstapa, the society dedicated to the study of monstrosity in the Middle Ages. Welcome, Drew. It is a pleasure to have you here. And I'm so excited because I've known Drew since he was a wee baby little grad student a long time ago. And I have watched the trajectory of his career. And I am so very proud of you and also very excited to have you here as my guest.
Kat, thank you so much for having me on. It's a real privilege to get to be here. I've enjoyed your
and you're doing so many fantastic things. Not only are you, just finishing your first year as an assistant professor at App State in art history, but your research has evolved amazingly from visual images, military history, and Islamic content and contact in medieval manuscripts, Jean de Froissart, all the way through the new work that you are doing on the Sultan of Babylon. So could you just kind of give us a broad overview on your areas of research?
Yeah, absolutely. So my primary area of interest is Latin Christian racialization of Islamic princes. And
so what does that mean? What exactly does that mean?
So in the Latin Christian imaginary, especially in the 14th and 15th century, after the fall of Acre in 1291, Europeans were really anxious about going back and getting the Holy Land. So this is not the early Crusades where they go and get it and they establish a kingdom. This is after they lose a lot of that land to ultimately the Mamluks. And they start writing propaganda manuscripts, or they start incorporating pro-Crusade narratives into their royal chronicles in different ways than they were doing before, in order to sort of inspire, convince princes or convince popes to go on new crusades. Now, here's the great thing about this. They never really get it off the ground, right? So they say they're going to go on a new crusade. The French king is constantly promises to go on new crusades, and never really quite gets it off the ground. And so you get this kind of, we're going to go get it back, we're going to go get it back. And in the end, what ultimately happens is the Ottoman Sultan in 1453 ends up taking Constantinople, and then they're like, oh, well, there's no way we're getting it back now.
Not even close, no.
It's an interesting part of Crusade history because it's really about thinking about doing something a lot and never quite doing it.
Well, and you consider even from the rhetoric of the First Crusade, and for the viewers who aren't familiar with Crusade history, 1095 is when Pope Urban II in Clermont-Ferrand declares the First Crusade. And there's a whole bunch of debate about why that became necessary in 1095. And Dr. Abels and I talked about that. Richard Abels and I had a conversation about it. Because, of course, in some respects, you had a lot of knights who had nothing to do. And they needed something to do, and they needed a place to channel that energy rather than doing it in their localities. And so creating that common enemy of the evil Muslims who have taken over Jerusalem was a convenient narrative. And then, of course, they succeed. And then they have the kingdom for what is it, about 100 years ish, as give or take. The Second Crusade, I'm not even sure I understand the point of that one. That's the one with Louis Capet and Eleanor of Aquitaine, and it's a miserable failure. And then, of course, the Third Crusade, again, was that to expand. You have more depth and breadth of that history than I do, to expand the holdings in the Levant and take over more land. That is the one very famously with Richard and Saladin. Saladin, who was an exceptionally good military commander, well respected by everybody, including the Christian armies. But then that's 1191, and that's a disaster.
1291.
Well, no, the first Battle of Acre.
The first Acre, yes, yeah. The first Acre,
yeah. The first one, the very first one is 1191 with Richard, 1191. But then it falls again because they get it in 1191, and they've got it for 100 years, and then it falls. And so, what you're talking about is this constant need to have somebody to fight against, and the literature and the art and the propaganda that is kind of infused into medieval culture in the 13th and 14th centuries.
Yeah, and it becomes a real important sign of royal identity for certain princes, right? The French king, especially as we get the sort of transition from the Capetian dynasty to the Valois dynasty, are defining themselves through the Valois are defining themselves through their Capetian crusader predecessors, right? So it becomes an important sign. Again, in the 14th and 15th century, that like, what do good French kings do? Well, they go on crusade, right? What is also really funny about this, though, is that, by the time we get into the 14th century, we're in the middle of, we have the 100 Years' War, right? And so as a result, what we sometimes have is the English king writing to the French king saying, hey, you collected all these taxes to go on crusade, and then you used it against us, right? So they would write these sort of polemic missives to, the other side saying, this guy's not being a good.
Well, and especially because the 100 Years' War, which lasted for more than 100 years, it's 1337, 38, until, again, I think, again, it's 1453. So it's kind of 14. When we get to 1453, a lot of things are falling apart, and the 100 Years' War is the English desire to take the French throne because they feel entitled to it. But as you've said, with the crusading idea, the Pope was trying to get everybody on board. You want all your kings of Christendom to do this together, and that's part of why it doesn't succeed. Correct? Because they're not. Because the English are like, yes, but we want the French throne. And the French are like, fuck you, it is our throne. Don't take it.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Right. And then it's like, well, we're going to use whatever finances we can and resources to fight against you. And so you don't have a unified Christian kingship to actually continue these crusades.
Right.
Especially after the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when Christians sack Constantinople, which is a Christian city, and take all of the artifacts and all of the icons. How do you think France ended up with the crown of thorns and bits of the true cross? Because they took them from Constantinople. So that creates a lot of rifts within the should-be crusading coalition. How does that intersect with your work?
Within the Christian coalition, you have a material reality, and then you have an imagined reality. So during the Crusades, Latin Christians sometimes teamed up with Islamic polities against other Islamic polities. Latin Christians sometimes teamed up with Mongols against Islamic polities. Sometimes Latin Christians and other Christians fought against each other, right? So those are the material realities. Now, the imaginary reality is this sort of, collective group that is going to go and take the Holy Land together, right, for Christendom, right? That
One
they
unified
imagine,
Christian polity.
yeah.
We're all in this together.
Asa Mittman has a really great argument about using the term Christendom and the limits of using the term Christendom as not only like anachronistic, but also not, I mean, of course, not doesn't really reflect a material reality, right?
Right. And I mean, and it's because I'm currently working on the courses for great courses on medieval Christianities plural. And so I have to finish the first 6 episodes, drafts of them. And looking at the way that Christianity itself was trying to define itself consistently throughout the Middle Ages, that's the only consistent thing about it, is that Christianity really couldn't agree on the color of shite. They really could not, because it's like some people wanted to believe this, some people wanted to believe that. So the idea of a unified Christendom is as erroneous as the idea of a unified crusading front, where it's all
Right.
Christians together against all Muslims.
Right, precisely. So if that's one half, I mean, to go back to your original question, if that's one half, is the sort of crusade imagination, the other part is understanding how pre-modern racialization functioned, right? So scholars such as Geraldine Hang and Suzanne Conklin-Akbari and Corda Whitaker have provide various definitions. The sort of trajectory of pre-modern critical race studies has been sort of developing over the last 30 years and comes out of critical race theory itself. So my definition as someone working on race and racialization is that racialization is the process by which individuals, internal or external to a society, cannot ever become full beneficiaries of that society on the basis of geographic origin, religion, or class. And so this definition allows us to sort of expand what racialization also might be, one, as a process, and two, as which I take from Susanna Conklin-Akbari's idea of a kind of process of racialization, but two, this concept of beneficiaries that I have used from Frank Wilderson's work on Afro-pessimism.
Okay, so the ontological argument about Afro-pessimism is what specifically?
So the ontological argument is that for Black people, that they can never be fully incorporated into the society ever, right? And he says so in a way that, for example, other minorities can be incorporated into the society. Now, it's a useful tool because of now, I don't use it in the same way that Frank Wilderson does, but it's a useful idea of thinking about who benefits within a society, right? Who benefits from the society? Can they be fully incorporatable? And we get really interesting nuances here that relate to the medieval world. So let's take, for example, the Mamluks, right? The Mamluks are enslaved soldiers who are largely imported from the Caucasus and from Eurasia, sometimes Christian, sometimes not, right? Young boys.
Is Mameluke the ethnic designation, or is this a one of those created terms that we have like Saracen?
No, Mamluk is a term in Arabic that means an enslaved individual, right? One who is,
so
right?
it simply means an enslaved individual, and in that particular context.
Yeah, in that particular context, we have the Mamluks, who are enslaved individuals, but they are, they're brought inserted into the Mamluk system that trains them in horsemanship and combat, right? And then they're ultimately manumitted right? They're ultimately freed. But then, if you've spent your entire life in this sort of like West Point system, you're just going to like, well, this is where I live now, right? Like
Right.
I'm
This is what I do.
thoroughly, yeah,
Yeah.
I'm thoroughly within this context. I'm not going to leave here now. Eventually, what interestingly happens is the Mamluks end up setting up their own sultanate. In the aftermath of Louis the Ninth's crusade, they sort of, there's a whole series of political moves that are made, including the wife of the previous sultan, Shajarat ad-Dur, taking the throne and ruling as sultan in her own name for like 3 months. But ultimately, what happens is these Mamluks take over. Now, here is an interesting case where we can think about a system that privileges enslavement, right? Because according to the Mamluk system, when they become sultans, only a Mamluk can ever become the sultan,
Which means
right?
they have to have been enslaved
They
first.
have to have been enslaved, but you cannot be born enslaved in Islam. And so technically, but not always, technically, the sons of Mamluk sultans could not become sultan themselves, but some of them do. The sons of Qalawun ultimately or the various sons, Al-Ashraf Malik Khalil and Nasir Muhammad
The sultans.
both become sultans as well.
Well,
But this is
okay.
an interesting case, right, where individuals are enslaved, right? They are enslaved, they had been enslaved, but they are also absolutely the beneficiaries of the society, right? Because they are the cream of the crop of the society. So we have a case where we can make a case for enslavement. Maybe we can make up, because again, racialization is a process. So maybe there's a racialization when they're young Christian boys who are imported from Eurasia and the Caucasus. But by the time they can become sultan, they're no longer racialized, right? So it's a process, right? One can gain and one can lose one's racialized status. And that's very similar to the ways, I mean, there's interesting threads to the ways that racialization functions today, right? The racialization of the Irish, the racialization of Italians. It's not something we really consider as much in our sort of contemporary discourse.
Well, and I will interject to that because you do often hear, and I say this as somebody whose family is a large contingent of them of Irish descent, but also a large contingent of fresh off the boat Swiss immigrants. My grandfather was first generation born here from Switzerland, but then the Irish side, my father's side, has been here since 1775. Um, but the Irish will still often refer to themselves in a racialized term where it's like, I'm sorry, you're white. It's, and the exclusionary tactics of 19th century America to say no Irish, no blacks, as though these two things were somehow correspondent. The Irish internalized that as a racial
Mhm.
designation when really it was a religious one. And
Mhm.
they created a racialized identity that wasn't really about race at all. It was really about religion. And if they'd converted to Protestantism, nobody would have cared. And
Right.
unless of course you didn't get rid of your accent, but that becomes a different issue. But you do see that especially in 19th century American politics, to racialize something that isn't really about race.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can also think about the ways that this works with class as well, right? So on one hand, with the let's take a different example. Let's take serfs and who are tied to land, right? That's not really um and
Enslavement, but
yeah,
yes.
right, yeah. I think, oh, I forget who it was who was written a great piece on serf and service and what these terms can mean and whether it means freed individual, not freed individual, right? Enslaved individual. It has multiple meanings over time. We can also sort of also think about the ways that class functions as racialization in the very same ways that we use the term, the term I use in quotes, white trash, right? Which is in a racializing designator on the basis of one's economic status, and that one has sort of not lived up to the appropriate white etiquette, right?
Right. Well, and it's like even if you consider the dialogue regarding human trafficking in certain parts of the modern world, but particularly in the late 19th, early 20th century, who would refer to white slavery as though somehow any non-white slavery was fine, but white slavery was an extra problem. And so when you put it in those terms, as opposed to condemning all forms of enslavement, you specify, well, we're only condemning enslavement if it's the wrong people who are enslaved. And that is part of that same designation, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. It is part of that same, yeah, exactly. It's part of that same tradition. Now, of course, the Mamluks themselves are recorded that many of them having been fair-skinned, and Bayabars was, I think, fair-skinned. One of the Mamluk sultans, one of the big pains in the ass for the Latin Christian Bayabars, um, al-Bundukari. He was reported to have blue eyes, like light hair, and fair skin. So like this also like throws a wrench into our sort of expectations, right, about what the world has looked like. And it also, I mean, the representations of racialization in the medieval world also throws a wrench into our expectations, right? So, and this is also something that is, I guess, connected, I mean, very much connected to my concept of cryptovisuality, because scholars, race in the Middle Ages has largely been um, a movement that has grown out of literary studies within our field, right? Now, there's some excellent art historians, Roland Betancourt, Pamela Patton, Asa Mittman, Brian Keene. There's tons and tons of excellent work that is being done in art history. One trend that I've noticed is that the objects that scholars tend to focus on are representations where racialization is very clear and obvious to us, right? So guy has brown skin, turban, scimitar, and a hooked
Arab,
nose.
right
Yeah,
there. That
right,
that is the markers of being an Arab, as it were.
right. Those are
Arab
the
in
markers of being
quotation marks. I'm putting Arab in quotation marks because it's a generic.
absolutely, absolutely. And so something something that troubles me is that there's a reality within Latin Christian manuscripts and within the Latin Christian visual tradition writ large, is that there's no consistency at all, right? Sometimes you'll get like, this is a Saracen and he is dressed as a Christian knight, or with fair skin, or they're indistinguishable, right? Or they are, or there's some other types of combinations. Sometimes they're wearing Christian armor, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're dressed up in the arms of the King of France. Why are they doing that, right? Why is the Sultan, why does the Sultan carrying around a cross on his side of the battlefield, right? There are these sort of various exceptions that, to me, I think require further investigation for two reasons. One, when we kind of like comb through the images to find the like most caricaturedly racist, cartoonishly racist version, right?
The hooked
Of
nose, the
with hook
turbans,
noses and turbans, and right?
and in some cases, and I will pause on this
Yeah,
one because sometimes those racialized images and features could be Jewish, could be Arab. They're kind of interchangeable for
yeah,
many Christian audiences.
yeah. Well, and some, I mean, it can also, I mean, I've seen representations of Saxons dressed as Muslims, right? I've seen representations of, I've seen different representations of Ethiopians. I've seen different representations of Mongols, right? So there's no real like epidermal or physiognomic or even accoutramental fixity, right? And so when we comb through and try to find the sort of like racistly, cartoonishly caricaturized versions, what we end up doing is kind of reproducing the racializing process, right? Where in which we're like, ah, yes, I found one. Look at it, right? Yeah, I
Look
found
at
one
this
in this
one
manuscript.
thing, yeah, that
Right. Because
represents
of
the
course these
whole.
manuscripts are very much like objects that live in the contemporary world. So as contemporary people who comb through them looking to find one, there is a kind of like racial curio action that we're taking. Right. So
Right.
that's one half of it. The other half of it is so if there are all these exceptions, right, where like Latin Christians look or Muslims look like Latin Christians or Jewish people are represented in the same guise of Latin Christians, what does that mean? Does that mean that racialization does not exist? Well, I would say no, because I work a lot on manuscripts, and the manuscripts are accompanied with text, and the text makes pretty clear that the Latin Christians don't like these guys, right? So part of my work really thinks about reception, right? These manuscripts are produced for princes, for lords, for popes, right? What would be the reception? What would be the reader's reception of these images? And how does text and image work together in order to consider or in order to think about racialization? So, for example, what does it mean for the Sultan of Babylon to get dressed up in the French king's colors, in the French king's armor, in a royal French manuscript, right? Taking the city of Acre, right? Taking the city of Acre. Well, some of this is because, this is an accusation, right? The term Saracen, again, is a term of impostorism. So here, the Sultan of Babylon is masquerading, impostorizing the French king's imagined royal authority over the Holy Land, right? Because again, French king does not have any
Yeah,
actual
not at
authority
all.
until 91. Philip the Fair he didn't have any he didn't have any political control, but the sort of imagination that like this guy is coming in and taking what should belong to the French king. So that's one example.
Well, especially because, of course, if it's a French narrative, you have that dynamic also French versus English, because again, it was Richard and Philip in that Third Crusade who were supposed to be allied and were really kind of in many respects not, because they had their own issues. But even the designation Saracen, when you look at a medieval literature text, a literary text that describes the Saracen, you rarely actually in medieval literary sources find somebody described as an Arab, the word Arab in any
Mhm.
sense. It is generally this generic catch-all stock phrase. And when I was talking to Nair, we discussed this because it's Suzanne Conklin Akbari, who
Yeah.
wrote about Saracens in Richard I and Richard Coeur de Lion, and that idea, well, what on earth is a Saracen? Well, a Saracen doesn't mean actual Muslims in any way whatsoever, because the beliefs are completely opposite. You have your Saracen who worships Muhammad, but also Apollo and has idols. And that's completely antithetical to Islam. And so the question becomes, well, did the author just really not know anything about Islam? Or is it that that designation is meant to be nonsensical? Because I am fairly certain a lot of authors knew quite a lot about Islam because there was a lot of contact, especially throughout Europe, the closer you get to the Iberian Peninsula. So are they creating literary stock characters that are convenient villains out of something that's really recognizably quote unquote exotic, but also inaccurate, deliberately inaccurate, because they're not trying to actually represent Muslims? I mean, that's part of the question. Is a Saracen meant to actually represent a Muslim, or is it the generic bad guy villain, your Islamic supervillain to an extent?
So this term, I think, has become quite debated over, especially because of Shukufeh Rajabzadeh's argument that says that scholars should recognize that Saracen is, and it is, a racist term,
Oh, it is.
and that it should be replaced with Muslim. That is the sort of
Yes.
in scholarship, and that we should not be using this term because of the harm, because of the racist harm that it does to Muslim people. Now, I want to acknowledge the like award-winning nature of this article. It really brings a lot of important focus to the terminology of how we use Saracen and the ways in which that sometimes, even while trying to use it critically or trying to use it sensitively, we find ourselves in a bit of mud. But I would also say that to some extent, the term Saracen does not just apply. Here, I disagree with Rajabzadeh. The term does not just apply to Muslims. It refers to Saxons, it refers to pagans, it refers to Trojans. In the Histoire del Saint Graal, the prequel to the Quest of the Holy Grail, it refers to the people living in Saras and actively refutes the false etymology about Saracens being that, which is what most scholars refer to, and why they say that it's a racist term that accuses Saracens or Muslims of impostorism, which is that Saracens pretend to take their lineage from Sarah instead of Hagar, right? But this text in the history of the Holy Grail actively refutes that narrative as well, right? Other examples in Marin Sanudo's Secret History of the Crusaders of the Cross, a propaganda manuscript in the aftermath of Acre, makes Saracens distinct from Muslims when giving the titles of the Sultan of Babylon. Lord, it's like Dominus Saracenorum, a Muslimanorum. So those are two categories, right?
Right.
Two different categories. So I think, I hear what Rajabzadeh is trying to say to us and caution us. But this term Saracen also, it doesn't quite communicate what we see in the visual program. And this might be a disciplinary difference between art history and literary studies, right? In the visual program, you have all manners of characteristics that are associated, right? So the very famous image that is sometimes, I think, misdesignated in the Luttrell Psalter as Richard the Lionheart versus Saladin. In what way this figure of Saladin in this manuscript is blue-faced, hook-nosed, fanged, right? So and he has a shield with an Ethiopian head upon it, right? So while the identity of the character might be that he is a Muslim, the various aspects that make it up are not inherently referenced to Muslims themselves, right?
And are
Because you have
contradictory and
right, they're
completely
contradictory.
contradicted. The idea of an image of a human being on the shield is completely anathema to Islam.
Well, I mean, even within the Latin Christian context, it remixes several different things, right? So Ethiopian is not necessarily Muslim, right? Blue skin is not only used for Muslims, it's also used for Jewish people and Ethiopians and Indians. Hooked nose is largely used for Jewish people and demons, and then has been associated here. So this rendering is a fiction, and it is a material fiction that combines various inherited imaginations of physiognomic, epidermal, and accoutramental racialization, but also how they've transformed over time. So I think that in my own work, I try to acknowledge the important work that Rajabzadeh has done, and also note that there's a maybe a disciplinary difference here, because to me, this is not because if we just use Saracen in place of Muslim, then we allied all those other groups under the aegis of Muslim as well. So we end up doing something in the we sort of go too far, right?
Well, and I mean, it's an exceptionally important point to say that, especially because if you start to, in scholarship, you're quoting a medieval text, and in literature, you quote the text, the quote says Saracen, and if you discuss it and refer to the Saracen as Islam, but again, do they mean Muslims? Is that really what the author means to begin with? Because it may not be. And I mean, as I said with my discussion with Nair, Song of Roland, I mean, the original Battle of Roncesvalles has nothing to do with Islam at all. Nothing,
Right.
nothing.
Right.
But in the poem, it's Saracens Are they really Muslims though? Because of course the original battle wasn't fought against Muslims. So is the poet of the Song of Roland conflating things for a stock enemy that isn't actually meant to stand in for Islam? So is it correct to replace Saracen with Muslim if that's not actually what they meant?
And also, even in cases, even because I think in the Song of Roland, because it's the Balagant is the Emir of Babylon. So he's definitely either Babylon is a term that is used either for Egypt or for ancient Babylon, and that's sometimes there's a lot of telescoping going on here, right? There's a lot of collapsing and telescoping going on.
Yeah.
But even in cases where, for example, the term is referring to Muslims, using Saracen to refer to as Muslims, oftentimes those texts don't differentiate between in historical texts, they don't differentiate between the Muslims, the historical Muslims, and the Christian bureaucrats who were in the armies of the Mamluk Sultanate, for example. Right?
Right.
Doesn't make any difference, right? It just calls them all Saracens, right? So we
Yeah.
know that there's a historical difference, but the text just calls them all Saracens, right? Sometimes you have Latin Christian attacks on Saracens, and it turns out these Saracens are actually Christians, right?
Right. Well,
And other
especially
times,
because I was to say, especially because if you consider that in Ethiopia and Egypt, especially in the early Middle Ages, the largest religious populations were Christian. I mean,
right?
Ethiopia has a massive Christian population through the 13th and 14th century, even after the advent of Islam in 622. And in Egypt, same thing. You've got Christian populations even as Islam is taking over and spreading itself across North Africa. There's still huge Christian populations in those places. So
Yeah,
if you say, well, the Saracens of Egypt, you may not be talking about Muslims to start with.
right. And it's so you have that. You have sometimes when they slaughter Levantine Christians and they call them Saracens, right? Because you put everybody under one umbrella, right? So there is again, we should use this term with caution. We
Absolutely.
should acknowledge that it is a racist term. I don't know about going as far as replacing everything from Saracen to Muslim, because I think that does the opposite. Like it does something else. It aligns to other identities and groups. And additionally, like Muslim by definition cannot impostorize ever, right?
Yeah.
Because Muslim is an active, what's the word? It's ism al-fa'il, but in English, it's an agent noun, right? So it means one who has submitted to, and from an Islamic perspective, one who has submitted to God. Now,
Right.
in theory, one who has submitted to God can never imposturize, right?
It's not possible. Yeah.
Right? Because one is not dishonest, one has accepted truth from an Islamic perspective, right? So in also doing this, we kind of water down what Muslim means grammatically, how Muslim is used in Islam, right? In order to kind of satisfy maybe something of our own English worries, right? English-based worries about using insensitive terminology, which again, I think is good, but in so doing, we kind of engage in a kind of linguistic colonialism, right? And linguistic colonization, because Muslim, by definition, is an active agent, right? That has agency. Saracen, on the other hand, does not have any agency, right?
Right.
It doesn't have any agency. It is decontextualized. It is heavily political. I agree with Rajam Zaid there. It is heavily political, but it is decontextualized.
And the
So,
politics of Saracen are very distinctly medieval in a lot of respects, in ways that a lot of modern scholars may not get the full context. This becomes the issue of understanding your context. It's even in discussions of the Moors in Spain, and I'm editing a volume right now, finishing this, that deals with a lot of Spanish texts from the Iberian Peninsula, and where they discuss Moors, there's a question, well, do we use Muslim or do we use Moor? Well, Moors are the people from North Africa, again, not always exclusively Muslim. Now, in the forced conversion after Isabel and Ferdinand, the Moriscos are the Muslims who were forced to convert to Christianity, and the conversos are the Jews who were forced to convert to Christianity. But they were forced to convert to Christianity. So if you use the term Moor, are you talking about the North African Muslims, but not all of them were Muslim? I mean, again, you end up in the same kind of conundrum. If we replace Moor because it's racialized in later texts with Muslim, are we again doing a disservice?
Yeah, no, and in addition to this, Saracen is, I mean, again, in the primary, I go back to the primary sources, Saracen is used for all manner of words. Saracen is a language. Some scholars have suggested that Saracen could be come out of Syrian. I mean, even some scholars have, and I'm fairly convinced by this. Saracen can come out of Arabic itself because saraka yasruka sarq means to steal, right? So Sarikun, Saraqain, it's pretty close to Saracen, means stealers or thieves, right? So it could have some Arabic etymological origins as well. Now, this is again not to deny. This is not to deny the use, right? Because what Latin Christians mean is something very racist, right?
Right.
Even if it comes from that, right? I mean, the same can be said about Mohammedan, right? There is a letter that is recorded. Louis IX had sent the Sultan of Saleh, but in a much later text, Arabic text, and he refers to the Muslims as I forget, but he says I forget what word he used for people, but he says Muhammadiyya, right? What he's saying is like the Muhammadi people, right? As
Right. The
opposed to
people who
the
worship, who follow Muhammad.
right,
Yeah.
Muhammad, right?
Yeah.
Now, of course, Muhammadan in 18th and 19th century texts gets all sorts of implications, but it also functions to a certain extent in Arabic um, when you have a phrase like Muhammadiyya, that's an adjectival phrase
Right.
referring to people who are and that e that you're hearing is very, so in Arabic like much like we have tricky or quickly or something like that,
Yeah.
that e functions as an adjectival
Yeah.
phrase, and so the Mohammedi people is not a bad translation.
And to say that as the followers of
As the
Muhammad
followers of Muhammad, right?
specifically. Yeah.
So, but again, so just because something exists doesn't make the use of it
Right.
not racist,
Right.
right? Yeah.
Well, and so in looking at the visual representations in texts like the Sultan of Babylon. Now, I'm not as familiar with the Sultan of Babylon as a text. So explain the plot because you gave me a brief amount of this when we did our wonderful TikTok video at Kalamazoo. Tell me more about the Sultan of Babylon as a text. Give us all a plot summary.
Of the Sultan of Babylon as a text,
Yeah.
is the English text, is the 15th century English text, or what I mean by the Sultan of Babylon
What you
in
mean by it.
right. So
Yes.
because there is a 15th century English text that is fascinating, and literary scholars have loved to read about it or to write about it. What I mean by the Sultan of Babylon is the designation that Latin Christians, English, French, or Italians give to the Sultan of Egypt, right? So it is a term that is commonly used for the Sultan of Egypt, but it's also it's also he's also a kind of fantastical prince of all Islamdom in more fantastical texts, such as the Middle English Sultan of Babylon or the Fiagras texts as well. So the Sultan of Babylon, to me, is a figure that embodies all the racialized anxiety that Latin Christians have in this moment where their main antagonist is the Sultan of Egypt, right? And he has all sorts of incredible powers, right? He, as I mentioned before, gets dressed up as the King of France, right? He rides leopards into battles, and he even can control the Nile with his will. Now, some of this is based in truth, and this is a really curious intersection of the ways in which multiculturalism and cultural contact are not the antidotes to racialization, but actually facilitate and encourage and help abut that racialization. So sometimes in our contemporary world, right, in our sort of modern society, we sort of see the antidote to racialization as multiculturalism. But I would argue that both in the medieval world and in the modern world, this is not exactly true. So I'll give an example from the medieval world first. So the Sultan of Babylon, in Marin Sanudo's Secret Histories of the Crusaders of the Cross, rides a panther or rides a leopard into battle. Right? I should be very clear. He rides a leopard into battle.
Very important that it's a leopard, not a panther.
Very important because previous scholarship has mistranslated the Latin as panther. And so, yeah, so it's called a pard in the Latin text, and previous scholarship is mistranslated as panther. Now, the Latin word for panther is panthera, not pard, right? Pard refers to
a leopard.
A leopard, right? It can refer to a leopard or a pard, a sort of bloodthirsty creature. A leopard or a leopard is a kind of miscegenated, sexually devious, bloodthirsty beast, right? So you have all of these implications, right, grafted onto the Sultan that really rhyme with the racial anxiety that Latin Christians have about Muslims.
Right.
Now, here's the interesting thing. When Sanudo first was writing his text, in early versions of his text, he has the Sultan zoomorphized as a bear and riding a bear as well, right? So in the Marin Sanudo text, he's zoomorphized in the images as a leopard in early versions and riding a leopard, and then in early versions, he's riding a bear. So what causes this shift, right? Well, the sigil, the sign of the Mamluk Sultan, Beybars, whose name means Great Panther in Turkish, was a big pain in the ass for all the Latin Christians, and stamped, his sigil is blazon of a rearing panther on all his coins and all his mosques and all his madrasas from Cairo to Damascus.
A panther.
Yeah,
a panther. Okay, a panther. Okay.
A rearing panther. Now, Italian merchants traveling east would have been familiar with this iconography. And so bring it back to mainland Europe, and then use this iconography as a kind of confirmation bias. Ah, yes, he calls himself a panther or a leopard, right? Clearly he is, this is what's going on, right? This sort of transmission, right?
Okay.
Or going to the Levant and to Egypt are receiving this information about the Mamluk Sultan's self-preservation. Especially in the 14th and 15th century, Marin Sanudo particularly is very good at capturing what the Sultan calls himself, right? In Arabic. So he in several manuscripts, there's an inscription that gives the titles of the Sultan of Babylon, which includes that earlier thing that I said of Dominus Saracenorum, a Muslim Minorum. But there's also, he calls An-Nasir Muhammad Lord Nasit, I think, but then gives his titles to include Alexander of the Age, which is a common Mamluk title, Iskandar Zeman, right? Alexander, like the modern day Alexander.
Oh, okay.
Right?
All right. Yeah.
Everyone in the medieval world identifies with Alexander. It's
because he's the one you want to identify with. Yes.
He's the only one.
He's
Yeah.
The hero.
Everyone wants to identify with
If
Alexander.
it's not Alexander, it's Charlemagne. If it's not Charlemagne, it's King Arthur. Pick one.
Right. Yeah. You've got like a handful of options, and that's it. So they clearly know quite a bit about how the Mamluk Sultan presents himself. And they use that to Marin Sanudo uses that to great effect. He changes it from a bear to a leopard. And indeed, I found an autographed version of the manuscript. So one of the first versions that Sanudo did when he made the change from bear to...
What's the date of this?
It is early 14th century. Early 14th century. So
and it's an autograph manuscript?
Yeah.
Holy shit. Yeah. People didn't do that in the Middle Ages, generally speaking. It's very hard to find an autograph manuscript.
I should clarify, it is believed to be the autograph manuscript.
Still.
Yes.
Still, 14th century, somebody who's like, hey, this is mine and I wrote it out myself. This is unusual. But no, that's fantastic. Okay, continue.
But in this manuscript, in the scene where the Sultan is zoomorphized as a leopard, you have this image of the king of Armenia was surrounded by various threats that are zoomorphized by various creatures. So lions represent Mongols, and the serpent represents pirates, and the leopard represents the Sultan of Babylon. The
Really?
only creature in this entire manuscript to have a erect penis is the Sultan of Babylon's uh, lion, right? And so like while he's doing this, he has the Sultan is also, or the animal is capturing with a sort of lasso that's run around its neck, capturing the people of Armenia, the men of the people of Armenia, right? So he is sort of castrated. Like there's this implication of like
The
castration and
castration narrative. Yeah, that
yeah,
they're taking the you said Armenian men
yeah,
specifically.
Armenian men, right?
And the idea of course, oh no, because they're going to come in, conquer, capture the men, and
Yep,
then rape the women, and
right.
it's that potential for miscegenation.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is and that miscegenation is very much written for, well before the 14th century. That fear of Latin Christian miscegenation with Jewish people and with Muslims, we find not only in the Fourth Lateran Council, very sort of clearly laid out, but also in the Council of Nablus in the late 12th century as well. So like this fear is very much at the forefront of the Latin Christian mind. So with 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 these types of representations, this is not something that they're making up.
Right.
It's the kernel of there's truth in there, and this is also true for many Latin Christian polemics, theological polemics, where they're like, after a while, they go, we really can't just keep saying these guys worship Apollo. We kind of have to just say we have
Because
to
we
like,
know, because too many people know that he does, that they don't. Too many people
yeah,
know that
right.
worshiping Apollo is bullshit in this
Right.
context.
We should
Yeah,
we should like battle them on their own
right.
intellectual grounds. Or something, so there's one example of this sort of multiculturalism. The
Well,
Nile.
I'm struck though still on the leopards because having looked at some of the bestiaries from the 13th and 14th century,
Mhm.
and when I was at St. John's at Oxford, I looked at two manuscripts and I took photos of. They were very kind and generous to let me photograph these manuscripts. So I
Ah,
have the illuminations because they are fully illuminated bestiaries. They're the same bestiary 100 years apart. And so
wow.
one's 13th century, one's 14th century, and the visualization of the animals and legendary creatures, some of them become more realistic looking in the 14th century, which means that somebody finally saw one, that they actually, now looked at that. But they had leopards. And I'm going to have to go back and read the Latin text to see what they say about the leopards. Because now I wonder if that kind of, if a certain amount of the lascivious attributes of leopards get encoded in the bestiaries themselves, because in some cases they talk about this. Well, that it's like with beavers, that when they're afraid, beavers turn around, stop in
Mhm.
pursuit, gnaw off their testicles and throw them at their attackers,
Right.
because that makes loads of
That
sense.
makes tons of sense.
So much sense. And of course, the idea of castor oil coming from the testicles of beavers. But that's in the bestiaries. And I wonder, I'm going to have to go back and look and see how do they describe leopards. And if the leopards are described in any of those terms that are then applied to the Sultan of Babylon.
Well, so that's exactly what I went back and did, is I found some bestiaries that differentiate between pards and or leopards and panthers. Panthers, of course, being a sign of Christ, right?
Right.
That's what really struck out to me from this early scholarship. Is like panther doesn't make any sense because panther is Jesus, right? Jesus gets lots of animals, but panther is one of them,
I did
right?
not know that. I didn't know
Yeah, he
that
gets
Jesus is
panther.
associated with panthers. When does that come about?
I would have to double check I read it in Deborah Strickland's work on bestiaries, but I'd have to double check at least by the 13th century though.
Okay.
But yeah, no, I think that's it's an interesting And then, and then from there, I mean, I was looking at another illuminated manuscript where the personification of anger is stabbing itself and riding a leopard, right? So it's like, well, this is very, this is very convenient. So there's clearly an association. This guy happens, the Mamluk Sultan Baybars, um, had clearly, conveniently had this iconography, and so why not, right? Why not? Propaganda is much better with a kernel of truth
Right.
than with sort of like made up stuff, right?
Well, and I was struck by the and I am fairly certain it was because gosh, the thing about having the Olympics and the World Cup at the same time, it's like, which team was this for? I think it was the Democratic Republic of the Congo football team. They were coming in, they were showing them coming in at the airport, and I think it might have been at Dulles. But the team wears leopard skin because they are the
Oh,
leopards. It's the Democratic Republic of Congo, and they beautiful suits, black suits with all of them wore a leopard skin kind of small mantle, and their bags were leopard skin.
oh
And
wow.
but you have to, obviously, sacred animals that you want to embody and embrace the certain characteristics, but the whole team, everybody, it was their kind of their team dress as their traveling uniform. All of their luggage was leopard skin, plus the leopard skin on their shoulders. And so when you say there's a kernel of truth, obviously in certain societies and traditions and culture, certain animals take on a sacred resonance for them, and then they can be parodied by people from the outside who then exaggerate them to racialize them. Yes?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even as you're mentioning this, I was just looking at the Fra Mauro map. That was incredibly detailed 15th century Italian map of Mappa Mundi, map of the world. And there's an interesting line that talks about Prester John, who is the king of Ethiopia, Abyssinia, sort of vague king that lives somewhere in Africa or India, that will sort of help the Crusaders, take back the Holy Land. But even his soldiers, even his warriors are described as, going into battle mostly naked, except for those who wear the skins of crocodiles, right? Which is both kind of like, now I want this movie, right? Like it's kind of badass, right? In that they're wearing crocodile skin. So this is a great question. Is this a racialization? Is this not racialization? Because there's a desire for there to be this imaginary European king or this imaginary Christian king who is not European, right? But then there's this sort of like there's this exoticism. So what are the boundaries between, we can think about the boundaries here between exoticism and racialization. We can think about the boundaries between enslavement and racialization.
Right. Well, especially because, as I said, there were notable and considerable Christian communities in Ethiopia, in Egypt, in India, because of course you have the Thomasine Christians in India as early as the second and third centuries who established a fairly large community in India. And I mean, you have Manichaean dualism that is of various shades of Christianity that thrives in China and was the state religion of the Uyghur Empire until the Mongols wipe it out. And
Yeah.
those are the same people who then are the Albigensian Crusade. They're the Cathars. So the idea that you might have Christian kingdoms in Africa, in North Africa, in Ethiopia, in India. Yeah, because you did. They just,
Right.
but they take on mythological status by the time you get to the 14th century.
Yeah, absolutely. And then that transmission also works the other direction as well. So you have what's it's is it Josephat? The story of the Buddha basically gets like
Josephat.
translated. Yeah, Josephat,
Yes.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm fairly certain it's
The story
Josephat.
of the Buddha gets like translated into like a Christian saint, right? It's just wild, right? So it
Well,
really,
because Sanskrit Bodhi means knowledge, just like Greek gnosis means knowledge, and the idea of both Buddhism from Bodhi for knowledge and gnosis, Gnostic knowledge, they share those similarities. And so for a lot of early Christians, I told you I've been researching, I've been up to my eyes in this for the last 4 days. Is again some Christians adopted this as syncretic traditions and said, yep,
Yeah.
yep, yep. And then they conflate them and say, sure, we got a Buddhist who's also this, who's also that. Because they saw the similarities in some respects and didn't differentiate.
Well, and that's the thing is that again, here's like this is the difference between the imaginary and the on the ground, the material, right? So you have like Mamluk texts that are complaining about like, geez, our, Muslims are like taking on Christian traditions, right? Or Jewish traditions. Like they're eating fish on Fridays or whatever, like they're doing
Yeah.
something like this. Um, and these are not part of the Sunnah, right? These are not sort of
Acceptable
yeah, they're not like
practices. Yeah.
examples of the way that the prophet, the way that the prophet lived. Um, so you have cases of that, but then you also have cases in on the opposite side where European Latin Christians are minting coins with the name of the Prophet Muhammad until Louis the Ninth shows up and is like, guys, what the hell are you? You guys got to stop. You can't do this anymore, right? So it requires like, this king to say, you guys cannot be Christians minting the coins with the name Muhammad on it anymore, right? So the on the ground is fascinating because it's messy. The 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 imaginary is fascinating because of the ways that it taps into the on the ground in order to extract out of what's on the ground and make it for its own purposes. But you also have, even in the imagination in Sanudo's Crusade manuscript, there's this great image of the Sultan of Babylon riding with his cadre of soldiers with black Nubian Christians pursuing him. And on the other side, you have European white Christians. So they're going to like pincer him and they're going to team up with their buddy, the Nubian Christians, to take out the Sultan of Babylon, who here is represented as fair-skinned. So you have a lot of, there's a lot of ways to see how this medieval world has both very different ideas about racialization, right? And very similar ideas about racialization. So there is a lot of like wiggle room here, and part of what I hope to do in my work is to understand how can we understand the representations of Muslims who are racialized. They are racialized in the texts that mention them as Saracens, even when they don't sort of fit within our kind of like expected markers of racialization, right? And also, like, sometimes a guy in a turban is just a guy in a turban, right? Sometimes a guy with dark skin is just dark skin. They're not actually the pistons that power the racializing agenda, right? It's other things. It's about imposterism. It's about masquerade. It's about it's about the ways in which text and image, work against or work with each other, right? It's about topography. It's less about. It's not much like racialization today. Racialization is both about color and culture.
Right.
Um,
Well, and
you
if
know,
you consider the fact that even in modern misconception, and of course this happened quite a lot after 9/11, the assumption that the bad guy, the Muslim bad guy in turbans, the majority of Muslims do not wear turbans, and but then you have Sikhs who are Sikh who are not
right.
Muslim at all who do wear turbans, and an awful lot of Sikh people were targeted after 9/11 because everybody just thought, well, if they're wearing a turban, they must be Muslim.
Right.
Well, if you have a medieval text and somebody's in a turban and you don't have any text that in any way identifies them as Muslim or something else,
Right.
then we shouldn't, as modern audiences, automatically assume it meant Muslim. Because
Right.
unless there's something in the text to tell us that that's what they mean, we might, in our own modern prejudices, assume it means Muslims, when
Right.
for a medieval audience, it may not. I mean, in so many respects, that's our prejudices as we interpret medieval texts rather than an actual prejudice in the medieval text. Is that what you
Absolutely.
find?
Absolutely. I mean, and again, there's at least in one Les Bonnes Chroniques de France manuscript. I think it's in the manuscript. I think it's in Royal MS-16 G6, the one for John II, which unfortunately is not accessible right now on the British Library. But I think it's in there that has a representation of a Saxon who was dressed up with a turban and sandals, right? And some other representations of Muslims later on in that manuscript are dressed in turbans and sandals. So this is, again, there's a bit of telescoping going on.
Right. Well, and of course,
Um,
it also depends on what the artist's frame of reference is, and
right.
and how much an artist is A, imagination, and B, encoding their own knowledge and their own experience. And one of the things that I have certainly found in my research is that medieval people had a lot more visual references for a broader range of things than we modern people give them credit for, because we again assume, well, people didn't know, they didn't see any,
Right.
they weren't aware. Well, that's not necessarily true. I mean, even as I was talking to Nair, the idea that people said with Shakespeare and Othello, oh, he wouldn't have known what a Moor looked like. Yes, he would have. He absolutely would have known the various possibilities of that, because people traveled. There were people of color in England in the Middle Ages. It happened a lot. And we, again, impose our own modern prejudices, assuming that there wasn't that contact and that people are making stuff up. But an artist might very often just draw what they know or exaggerate it for imaginative purposes.
So yeah, no, absolutely. And two things there, right? Like one, you were talking about production, but also what does it mean on the side of reception if you have an image of a Saxon who's dressed with turban and sandals, and later on you have Louis the Ninth fighting Muslims in turban and sandals, then those two categories are collapsed into one another as
Right.
mutual non-Christian enemies of the French crown,
Bad
right?
guys, the
Bad
bad
guys,
guys.
right? Bad guys, right?
They have the
So,
black hats. These are the black hats. It doesn't
yeah,
matter. It doesn't matter what they look like under the hat, but they got the hat. And
yeah.
the
And
hat tells you bad guys.
that doesn't mean that they're not racialized. It's just you have a racialization of Muslims that is connected to, associated with the racialization of non-Christian Saxons as
Right.
well, right? Which really throws our concepts into a loop. So absolutely on the reception side, and then I forgot the other thing that you had just mentioned. I'm so sorry.
Well, if we're talking about reception, how an audience would have thought, what they would have seen, what is the intent as the
Right.
artist? If the artist is going off of their own frame of reference, or if they are exaggerating things for their own purposes and telescoping, as you say, okay, bad guy means turban, period, full stop, end of story. Doesn't matter what they look like under the turban. That just means bad guy. How does an audience receive it? How does a 14th century audience receive it?
Right. No, and they can only, a French king who is, claiming that he's going to go on crusade, that promises he's going to go on crusade, is going to receive it, right? It's going to receive this very, in very much political and religious, through political and religious lens, right? And we have to sort of understand that. Now, does this mean, I mean, again, does this mean that like everyone in medieval Europe or medieval France was reading these manuscripts? No, right? But for the power brokers, right, at the people at the very top, the people at the very top were facilitating this type of knowledge, right?
They were
And it's the
commissioning it too. They were paying for it.
yeah, they were paying for it, they were facilitating it, they were incorporating it into their politics, right? And that's so much where this, that's so much where this comes from. That's what I was going to say. I mean, so much of this notion that there were no, like people of color in Europe at all in the medieval world. I mean, it's, to some extent, this is it's our fault, right? As medievalists, it's our fault. We inherit this legacy. This is all comes out of our own 18th and 19th century origins,
White
right?
supremacist
Yeah,
origins,
white supremacist,
colonial
colonial
origins.
origin,
Yes.
right? That is very much interested in a pure white Europe, Um, but it always strikes me as hilarious given the juxtaposition between the foundation of medieval studies and then the foundation myths of Europe in the Middle Ages, where everyone comes from Troy,
Oh, wait.
right? Everyone comes from Troy.
No, I'm sorry, but in the Lever Gavala in the 11th century, they don't come from Troy. They come from Moses. The Irish were like, hold my beer. We come biblically all the way from Moses. They stop off in Troy. You get a couple Trojans, but you're
You
right.
get a couple
And I
Trojans.
say that
Yeah.
tongue in cheek because, of course, the Lever Gavala is 11th century. But I mean, the Lever Gavala is the book of invasions. It's the book of takings of Ireland that envisions people coming from the Middle East, from, the Mediterranean area, biblical lands, stopping off from Troy and into Ireland in successive ways. And actually, the final people who become the Irish are the Milesians who come from Spain.
Right. Okay. Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the Lever Gavala is amazing. There's a lot to the Lever Gavala. But you're right. And in the 12th century, everybody wanted to envision a history that started with Troy.
Let's start with Troy, right? So all that has happened is that we've just switched locations, right?
Mhm.
All that's happened is we've just sort of switched our sort of points of reference. We switch it from Troy to um, we switch it to Troy, we switch it to Greece, we switched it to Europe, right? And all it is, it's the same cycle over and over again. But it is like that history is something that medievalists really we constantly need to contend with, that historiography. The other side, of course, of that historiography is that we cannot do anything without it as well, right? Like there is no destroying the historiography as well, right? So
Right.
this is a kind of important balance. I mean in Islamic art, the surveys that Cresswell did of Islamic photographs are incredible, right? And there's been no such extensive survey as he has done since that time, right? So, does a lot of this come out of a colonial context? Absolutely. Does it come out of white supremacist context? Absolutely. Are we the inheritors of it as scholars working this field? Absolutely. Um, but I think, there's ways to be like responsible with our own historiography as well, and not try not to reproduce the foundations of our discipline.
Right.
Um,
So, from what you just said, in terms of our inheritance and our responsibility as medievalists, I mean, because you're absolutely right, 100%. And I mean, we even see it in modern Europe with the discussions still about what it means to be European and who is European. And unfortunately, this push towards fascism and white supremacy in a lot of European countries who are like, well, we don't want to let in these people who are not white. That is, in some ways, an inheritance from this mythology of a period of time where Europe was pure white. It has never existed. It does not exist. So, can you explain or perhaps tell us what can the modern world learn from looking at the art history and the literature in tandem that you work on? What does that have to teach us in the modern world?
Well, it shows us a couple of things. One, it shows us that the narratives that we are now creating about a pure European white Europe is both, on one hand, it comes from the sort of medieval past, right? And on the other hand, it is completely contrived and constructed, right?
It's bullshit.
Um, it is
Not
all,
to put too fine a
yeah,
point on it,
it
it's
is.
bullshit.
It also teaches us the realities of political complexity. It is very easy for contemporary white supremacists to frame migration or European identitarians or whatever they want to call themselves now, um, to frame migration as a kind of, for example, a sort of Battle of Tours, invasion of Muslims or whatever, right?
Or people with brown skins, because they're not all
Or people
Muslims.
with
It's just the
skin.
simple fact of we don't want these migrants who are not white to infiltrate. It's again that infiltration mythos.
Right. It's very easy for them to do that, but somehow ignore the material realities of the on the ground stuff, where Christians are fighting Muslims, Christians and Muslims are teaming up to fight other Christians. Christians and Muslims are teaming up to fight other Muslims, right? Those are all material realities within crusade contexts, writ large, right? So it can teach us the ways in which to be sort of, better aware of the propaganda that we are being sold, right, by certain political actors, because the medieval world does give us a lot of the art, does provide for us. It's in the lineage of our modern racializing impulses, yes, but it has a great deal of complexity, right? It has a great deal of complexity. It also, I think, um, to, I don't not necessarily be even-handed about it, but Geraldine Hang does say, this whole project of race in the Middle Ages is not about blaming the West and not the rest, right? And we can really see the ways that in which, at least the medieval Islamic world, did racialize various groups, right? What does it mean let's go back to the sack of Acre of 1291, when Ashraf Melech Khalil took a Gothic portal, dragged it back to Cairo, where it was later installed into a madrasa. There may have been captured Christians who dragged this portal back to Cairo from Acre. What does it mean to take something, to expropriate something, transport it by the people that you have captured in order for it to serve as the seat on which you build a Islamic edifice, right? That too that too is racialization,
Of
right?
course.
And so we have a tendency to understand. Now, that this is not to say that somehow there's a whatever they call it, reverse racism.
Right.
That's not what this is really about, but rather that the history and the legacy and the processes of racialization are parallel and different at various times and various places, depending, of course, on, and once again, who is the beneficiary of the racialization.
Right. Well, because at the end of the day, I mean, and this is an important point and distinction to make, because of course, in modern society, especially with people of the fairer, depigmented, those of us who are melanin challenged, to point out, and I've had conversations with people recently who are like, oh, well, I was the only white person in this place. And my response is yes, and so that does not mean that you are automatically subject to racism because you
Right.
are the only white person in this context. Look at the context you are in. And race, especially when it comes to European and American societies, white is the status quo. White is the de facto. Therefore, if you are not white, you can be bigoted, sure, but you're not racist because you don't get reverse racism in that respect.
Well, and I mean, even the term reverse racism reveals it, it sort of gives away the plot,
Yes.
right? Racism is fine. It shouldn't just be happening to me, right?
Right.
Because if it
Yes.
was just racism, then it would just, if we lived in a society where in which white people were marginalized, systemically marginalized, then we would just call it racism,
Right.
right? Right? If we would just call it racism, there wouldn't be no reason to have it be called reverse racism, right?
Right. Well, and
So,
it was, sorry, go ahead, finish your thought.
oh no, there's I think every time there's that articulation, there's sort of because I believe I really do believe in the intelligence of people, and I think that there's a awareness that it ought to not be happening to me because it's not my natural condition.
Right.
But that it happens to you is fine.
Right. They not my natural condition thing. And when you're talking about, you know, points where a white person is like, well, I was the only white person in the room. And are you bringing that up because did you actually, was it simply that you noticed it and felt uncomfortable because you were the only white person in the room? Well, why was that? I mean, was it simply because you recognized that perhaps, maybe you benefit from the structures of white supremacy. I mean, when I taught at Longwood, I had Black American students, and I make that distinction because at UMBC, I have a lot of students who are from African countries who have a very different frame of reference.
Yes.
And at UMBC, one of my students who was from, I believe she was from Uganda, she came to me and said that she asked me to explain American racism to her. She didn't understand it. She's Black, but she's from Uganda, where she has not had to experience that. And she did not understand. And her Black American friends had to explain what it is because she had no frame of reference. And she came in
Right.
and said, "What do you mean?" And I tried to explain the complicated and problematic history of this country to frame that for her. But when I was at Longwood, my Black American students would say, and we had a discussion about this in one of my classes, they said if they walk into a room and there are fewer than two Black students, they don't feel safe or comfortable in that classroom. And this is in rural Virginia.
Yeah.
And so for a white person to say, "Oh, well, I was somewhere in Baltimore and I was the only white person," it's like, well, get over it. You were obviously you were fine, but at the end of the day, why did you feel like that was something you needed to remark on? Is it because you were somehow trying to equate this as, "Oh, but look, racism exists, and there was this moment when I was a minority." And when people want to argue about South Africa and the dynamics, it's like, well, the white minority, that is the whole nature of apartheid, is that the white minority exercised absolute, complete, brutal control over the non-white majority. So minority status does not automatically make you marginalized.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and I mean, at the same time, right? We can going back to the sort of notion of class. European nobility was the minority, right? That establishes power, political control,
Right,
right?
which is why
Yeah.
race is about a power dynamic more so than anything. And so I think and this is in terms of the work that you do, it's very important because it shows us the complexities. And even our modern scholarship often wants to dilute our discussions of race from our own frame of reference. So, your final thoughts on how we do better by looking at that complexity
How we as medievalists do better by looking at
and
complexity.
and the general public by understanding it.
Medievalists, we are fundamentally tied to our 18th and 19th century origins, right? So in those moments, when they are writing medieval history, they're writing medieval history as 18th and 19th century historians. Medievalists should recognize that we are really a modernist field, right? That we should not shy away from thinking about modern terms, modern concepts, modern theories when studying the Middle Ages, because the discipline has always been a modern one. Now, we might remodify how something works based on how the past is different, but that shouldn't make us think that we're not absolutely modern, a discipline that is built on European modernity, whatever that means, right? So when we read a critical edition of a text, that's a contemporary representation. That's not a medieval one, right? When we look at manuscripts that have been lost because World War One or World War II and only exist in a 19th century printed version, right? That is some kind of um, edited version. We are always working as modern scholars. So nothing stops us from using our contemporary theories or contemporary understandings of the world of interpreting the past. We might need to temper that with the evidence that the past gives us, but there's nothing because that's who we've always been, right? And that's a way of reclaiming that historiography, right? It's a way of rejecting that racist white supremacist legacy is, in addition to the many other ways of doing it, also producing, hopefully, an anti-racist one.
Ideally, yes. And Drew, thank you so much for such a wonderful, wonderful conversation. I really appreciate it. And I'm delighted to follow your research from where you go from now and the trajectory, because I'm very excited about all of these possible avenues. And I want to thank you so much for being my guest on the podcast.
Thank you so much. It was a delightful being here and speaking with you.
Thank you so much. And I'm Dr. Larissa Tracy, and this is Medieval Mischief and Mayhem.